Second, I fundamentally believe that this language, as Representative Brown and Representative Moulton and I and many constitutional lawyers have drafted, addresses all the concerns that other people have raised. I just want to make that clear. There is nothing that limits the president from engaging in actions to defend our troops or imminent threats or any of our allies or Israel. You will understand the skepticism of people who have been trying to stop bad wars when people who have supported a lot of those wars are suddenly picking at the language and saying, let's wait, let's do other things. Now, I am taking in good faith the suggestions of Representative Bishop and Representative Gates. I mean, Representative Gates and I don't agree on many things, but he's been very principled on a lot of non-intervention issues. And other members on the other side, and Representative Moulton and Representative Brown and I talked, and we would like to see a genuine, if we can get a bipartisan effort, we would prefer that.
And my commitment to you is, if we can get a bipartisan effort, that's great. But my commitment is, even if we can't get a bipartisan effort, we will have a vote on the floor on this issue. And the language problem, and this is what I went through with on the AUMF, I'd write it up, I'd show it to one group of people, they'd say, okay, well, this is clearly what it means. I'd show it to another group of people, just as knowledgeable, and they would say the exact opposite, looking at the exact same language. So there are a lot of complications to work through here, and the simpler is the better. I think we've covered this. If the gentleman would withdraw, he has my absolute commitment that I want language in this bill that makes clear that there will not be an unconstitutional war in Iran, and we will be committed to doing that on the floor. This language, I don't think, at the moment is going to get us there. So if you would withdraw, we will continue to have that discussion and make sure that it's ready for the floor. You have my commitment on that.
Out of respect for your leadership, I will withdraw the amendment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. With that amendment withdrawn, where are we at here? Next is log number 306 by Mr. Moulton. You are recognized on your amendment. No, sorry. Mr. Moulton, you're recognized. I'm sorry, you have to say you have an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Well, the clerk will distribute the amendment, and without objection, will dispense with the reading of the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized to discuss.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would increase the authorized number of Afghan special immigrant visas in the chairman's mark by 4,000 visas. I want to acknowledge and thank the chairman for his work to authorize an additional 300 visas in the underlying bill. But there is still so much more work to be done. Congress created the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program to bring safety to the brave men and women who risked their lives to help the U.S. mission on the ground in Afghanistan, who risked their lives not just for their country, but for ours. These brave people looked at America and believed in the ideas behind our nation so strongly that they were willing to risk their lives to bring those freedoms to their country. And their support for our mission exposed them to direct threats and jeopardized their safety and that of their loved ones. Those risks remain, but in recent years, the SIV backlog has continued to grow. Congress has struggled to provide enough visas to bring our allies to safety here in America. Thousands of Afghans are still waiting on the safety that only comes from within our borders. So I want to thank my colleagues, Representatives Walz and Crow, for co-sponsoring this amendment and for their support for the program. They have their own very personal stories to share about the invaluable support they received from their partners in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I look forward to working with the chairman, the ranking member, and Mr. Walz and Crow to ensure we live up to the promises we made to our friends and partners, but I will be withdrawing the amendment so that we can find funding sources for it. With that, I'd like to yield my time to Representative Walz.
Thank you, Representative Moulton. Thank you for your leadership on this. Not only do I share your commitment to finding funding for this important program to increase this cap, but I also share your commitment to getting to the bottom of why this State Department is having such a hard time providing these important visas. I'll just, we all have our stories. I've sponsored Afghans coming over here. I've also lost Afghans who are executed along with the members of their family while on the waiting list, which is now over 50,000. I just can't overstate how dangerous it is for not only for these men and women, but their entire families to work with us. And I can't overstate what a strategic issue it is for our armed forces. Allowing these Afghans and Iraqis to be killed who have worked with us, or deploying forces without effective interpreters and translation support is like deploying them without radios. They are ineffective in talking to the populace, and right now they're getting the signal loud and clear that America won't live up to its word. So I thank you again for your leadership, and I share your commitment to improve this program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz.
Gentlemen, yield back.
I'd like to yield my remaining time to Mr. Crow, Mr. Chairman, if that's all right.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Moulton, for your leadership on this issue, and Mr. Waltz as well. I would reiterate that there is a very important moral element to this, that we have folks across the world, and obviously particularly in Afghanistan, who have risked their lives and put everything on the line for our country and for what we represent and what we have been fighting for. And we certainly have to honor that. But there's also another dimension to this as well, and that is a national security dimension. You know, our ability to operate in many places throughout the world relies on our ability to actually recruit interpreters and local support. And if folks do not think that our word is good, that we will honor them, that we will protect them and their families, we will not be able to recruit that support, we will not be able to communicate with local populations, and we will not be effective in many places in the world. So we have to maintain our moral credibility as well as our logistical credibility and be able to honor our promises to folks. I yield back the remainder.
Thank you. And just so, I'm sorry, if
Mr. Chairman, I yield.
every year we try to get as many of these visas. The problem is it's a mandatory score. For whatever bizarre reason, we got to come up with mandatory money in order to fund these. We search for as much mandatory money as we can, and we'll continue to do that once we get in conference. It is an important issue. With that, the amendment is withdrawn. And next up is log 501 by Mr. Thornberry. For what purposes, gentlemen, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment, and without objection, reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Thornberry.
Mr. Chairman, this may classify as tilting at windmills, but it has been a bipartisan, admittedly, issue that we continue to require reports, written reports, when briefings and other information transmission would often suffice. As was noted earlier, in the underlying chairman's mark, there is a 34% increase in the number of reports this year over last year. It's a 79% increase over the year before. In the last 2 months, Pentagon has sent 24 reports to us at an average cost of $60,000 for each report. So just the increase, and this doesn't include any amendments, anything we've done today, just the increase in the underlying mark is about $14 million. If you look at the 1,149 reports that were required in last year's NDAA, that's about $70 million. Some of it is absolutely necessary, but too often we default to requiring a report without considering the cost. I don't get rid of any of them. All this amendment does is says they all expire at the end of 2021. So that if we need it, we can renew it. But let's just not have these things go on forever. I yield.
I am willing to accept this. It's late. We could fight about this forever. We have other things to fight about. We'll have to discuss it going forward because there are some of these reports are more important than others. And look, part of the problem, as you know, and this is not peculiar to this administration, the Department of Defense is not always terribly cooperative about providing information with Congress. So we get pissed and we put it into law and we force them to do it. If there was a better dialogue between us, we would be better off. But if we could promise not to debate this further, I'll go ahead and accept it, and we'll figure out if there are perhaps some reports that we want to make sure we preserve. We'll look at it more closely and maybe limit it to the number of reports that are sunsetted in 2021 to ones that are more, I don't know what the word would be, less important than the others. Let's put it that way. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed? The amendment is adopted. Mr. Kelly is now up with log 224. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will pass out the amendment, and without objection, reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering this amendment because the report language that I'm moving to strike is presumptive and would bias the outcome of the report. Mr. Chairman, as we all know, we have a periodic review board process which determines if detainees no longer pose a threat to national security and can be transferred, specifically talking about Guantanamo Bay. And I understand that many of my friends on the other side of the aisle think that this process, the periodic review board, is too slow, that it doesn't move fast enough. But this is an area that we can't afford to be at 80%, 85% correct, 96% correct. This is one where we have to be 100% correct. It requires due diligence more than almost anything else that we do. And when we're talking about Guantanamo Bay, it's a very partisan issue at times. But I was fortunate enough when I first came here 4 years ago to be able to go on a trip to Guantanamo Bay, just like I visited the border. And because I was taking other people's words on these things, and I believed what other people told me. And so I had this perception in my mind of what we were talking about, and when I got there, it was absolutely not true of what I had in my mind based on other people's thoughts. And I would just tell you, in other places it references the closing of Gitmo, or we talk about bringing Gitmo detainees to the United States for medical treatment, and there's a whole lot of different ways that we talk about. But here's what I say, Mr. Chairman. When you visit there, these are not, the numbers will shock you of how many there are really that are there. It's not a great number. So knowing how many people are there, first of all, we're not talking about this large population. We're talking about a very finite amount of human beings who have been detained for crimes in war crimes or war acts. These detainees are not some good people. So you will hear stories of detainees and, well, this person only did this small thing, and so they should be released or they should do this. They are the worst of the worst. And in Iraq in 2005, I don't mind rules of war, and I get rules of engagement, and I get things I don't like, even as a soldier. But I literally captured soldiers for trying to blow me up, sent them through the judicial process in Iraq, and before I left home, they had been released, and that same person tried to blow me up again. We can't afford to make a mistake and put these people back. We can't rush the decision. We can't be time-driven. We have to be 100% correct that they do not go back on the streets to try to kill more Americans or our allies. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I ask people support my amendment to strike the language, and I yield back.
Thank you. The issue here, there are broader issues, and we will debate a number of different issues here, and you kind of threw a bunch of them into this one amendment. This one amendment is focused on, and I don't know what the number of individuals is, but it is a very small number of individuals who have been cleared for repatriation. In other words, they have been determined not to be a threat. It's also worth noting that a lot of the people who were rounded up at Gitmo early on, it was a little chaotic when they were doing it at the start. And they weren't all people who had blown people up. A lot of times, better safe than sorry. And we have repatriated a lot of them. And we're not even saying, in the part that you're striking, you have to send these people back. All we're asking is, okay, you cleared them some time ago, and this is the Trump administration that's going to be making this decision, not the Obama administration. They've been cleared by the Trump administration. Trump administration has accepted that, and they have not been yet released from Guantanamo and sent back to a country. We would like to know where that process is at and why. So all of your arguments say, we'll get to some other portions of this where what you say we can, but on this portion, it doesn't really make sense that we wouldn't ask, why aren't you repatriating these people? And wouldn't be that hard for them to tell us. They just haven't. So that's all we're asking here. So, I mean, there may be some other parts of this where we have clear disagreement on, but I wouldn't think we would have that big a disagreement on this piece of it. And with that, I'll yield to Ms. Sherrill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make clear that these were several individuals, not the full group, who had been cleared for repatriation. Several of them have been successfully repatriated, I believe in Guam and Palau and South America, and reports have detailed who those people were. I think some of them were Uyghurs from China that were kind of swept up in a bit of a dragnet and should not have been. And that is why they were cleared for repatriation. It is a very lengthy, detailed process. It took years for them to get to that point, and for the United States government to convince itself that they, in fact, should not have been put in Guantanamo in the first place and were not terrorists and should be repatriated elsewhere. So this is a small subset, not people that were picked up on the battlefield that had presumably committed some of the bad acts.
Ms. Hartzler.
Will the gentlelady yield, or has she yielded back, Mr. Chairman?
I'm sorry. Ms. Hartzler has the time. If you wouldn't mind yielding a quick minute to Mr. Kelly, that would be helpful. Ms. Hartzler.
I will yield in a minute just after I make a point here.
Sure.
So I support the gentleman's amendment, but I just wanted to share some facts that I've been to Guantanamo 3 times, Gitmo. There were originally 779 detainees, and there are 40 that remain. 10 face charges under military commissions, 30 are indefinite law of war detainees. And so we're only talking about 40 individuals, and the language in the underlying bill says that the lack of transfers is having a substantial negative impact on the functioning of the process and other proceedings, as well as the detainee population. The committee believes the repatriation process should recommence immediately and urges the administration to facilitate the transfer process without delay. I just, disagree with that. I mean, a lot of the people have already been transferred. We only have 40 left, and 10 are under the military commissions. They're facing charges, and there's 30 that are really, really bad people that helped organize attacks on our country. So
just one quick second.
Yes, I will.
Does staff know how many people out of those 40 are currently have been deemed to be eligible for repatriation, and how many we're talking about in this amendment?
I believe that's 5.
Right. So again, it's late, and there are a lot of other things to debate on Guantanamo, but if we can stay focused on the 5 here that have been declared eligible for repatriation and argue why we shouldn't ask the administration, why haven't they been repatriated when the decision has been made? And I'm with you. The bad, we can talk about that. We're talking about 5 that have already been declared to be repatriatable, if that's a word. And the purpose of this is to say, yeah, why haven't you sent them back? We focus on those 5. I yield back.
Thank you. Reclaim my time. The wording in the underlying bill, though, says the committee believes a lack of transfers poses serious, makes it sound like there's a huge amount of people and they need to be immediately. And I'm not aware of the 5, but I will yield to the gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Chairman, and I think that is my argument. That's the main problem that I have, is that I'm a wordsmith, and I'm sorry, but words matter, and they have meaning in each and every one. And that may be part of going through War College where you had to write in too few words. You couldn't, but it almost sounds like we direct them to come out with the outcome that we want, Mr. Chairman. And I don't know that that's your intent, but if our intent is, if you take this out and you say, we urge the administration to facilitate the transfer process without delay, I have no issue with those words. What I do have issue with is the committee believes that the lack of transfer poses serious policy and human rights concern, and that the lack of transfers is having substantial negative impact on the functioning of the PRB process and other proceedings, and on, as well as the detainee population and Joint Task Force Guantanamo personnel. The committee believes repatriation process could recommence immediately. I'm okay with the order, saying some of that, but I think almost we're directing the outcome that we want to get, and that is my issue with the words. Sometimes I think shorter is better and less is better when those words matter.
If the gentleman will yield, actually,
Absolutely.
Ms. Hartzler will yield. It's her time.
Yes.
Yeah. You can't almost direct someone legislatively. Either you direct them or you don't. Now, I will grant you that there is encouraging language there, but we are not directing them. But I don't mind softening that language a little bit. I'm just trying to figure out process-wise how we do that. I don't want to mess around with an amendment to the amendment at this hour of the morning. I'm willing to accept the gentleman's amendment, and we'll work on something a little more user-friendly for the floor, and we'll work with you on that, unless someone has a strong objection to that approach.
Thank you, Chairman.
Further discussion on the amendment?
I yield back.
Oh, thank you, sorry. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Kelly, we're back with you on log 225. For what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will pass out, and without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Mr. Kelly.
Once again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the time. And before I get into this, I want to thank you for the hard work and that you put in on this entire NDAA. And I think I told you early on, I made a bet with folks that I thought you would get this done and get it done on time and in a bipartisan way. And I still believe that this deep into the process. So let's get there, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would strike Section 1034 of the Chairman's Mark, which is a sense of Congress stating that the SecDef should take into account standard of care at facilities administered by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. These people do not need to be housed on United States soil, ever. Gitmo is the most appropriate and safest place to hold these detainees. The medical care and treatment facilities there, including the people experts we can fly in for specific needs or things that they need done at Guantanamo Bay, we can provide any level of care there that they need and provide the experts there without bringing them to the United States. As a former district attorney and looking at the immigration laws and all the issues and all the federal laws we have with people claiming asylum, whichever side you're on, the problem is we don't know at what point they touch American soil. If they claim asylum in the right court, at the second then we have a 2-year court battle where some of these people who are the worst of the worst are now on U.S. soil with the opportunity to stay here. And so I urge you to support this amendment. Let's look at ways to improve the medical facilities there or the medical treatment there, but let's do not take an opportunity to bring people who should never come to the United States to give them the opportunity to harm more Americans. And with that, I yield back.
Ms. Sherrill.
I would just like to bring to the attention of the committee that we now have about 40 detainees, and it costs about $4.5 million each year per detainee, which is 55 times the cost of holding an individual in a federal prison here. The difficulties of providing medical care on the island are increasing as the population ages, so we expect that cost to go up. And the United States already safely holds more than 400 terrorists in federal prisons across the country, including the 9/11 plotter, the Boston Marathon bomber, the shoe bomber, the underwear bomber. None have ever escaped. Federal courts have regularly proved effective in convicting terrorists, and we've already put them through, several of them, convicted them in military tribunals. So I think this is something that the committee really does have to take a clear look at, because it is becoming more and more difficult to hold these detainees in Guantanamo.
Thank you. Recognizing myself, the exact language being struck here. The mark expresses a sense of Congress that medical care at Gitmo should meet adequate standards, and the DoD should take into account relevant standards at other facilities, such as the Bureau of Prisons in designing policies. We're not talking about transferring to the U.S. in this section. We're simply saying that we should look and make sure that adequate medical care is being provided, because we've received a fair number of reports that it's a bit problematic. In fact, one of the problems that we've heard is that have a hard time having someone sort of advocate for the health care of the detainees and basically say, you know, they got a problem here and that they are not getting the help they need. And we just want to make sure that there is adequate health care. So it seems like a reasonable provision, and I oppose this amendment.
With the gentleman yield? With the gentleman yield?
Yes, Mr. Conaway.
Mr. Chairman, is there some evidence that over the 17 years we've held folks down there that the health care was not adequate?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I had a couple of judge advocate generals in my office talking about a gentleman down there now.
Well, one person out of 700. I bet you could find a lot
Sorry,
of.
did you
But anyway,
know the time?
I just don't know that that's
Sorry,
the
you
issue.
asked a question. I was taking a stab at answering it there, and was told basically that, you know, the guy has back problem, can't walk and everything. They didn't heed that. They put him on a bus, took him for a 10-hour hearing where he was sitting around waiting forever. Nothing ever happened. Put him on the bus, took him all the way back, and he was not in medical condition to do that, and there was no one there to advocate him. So yes, there is some evidence. So we would like to.
Could you clarify that 10-hour thing? I don't know there's any, you can ride a bus 10 hours in Guantanamo Bay.
Sorry, the 10-hour thing is how long he sat waiting for what was going to happen that didn't happen. Then he had to go back to where he was. This is what the Advocate General explained to me when they came into the office. So yes, I have been presented with evidence that there has been inadequate health care. And all this portion of the mark does is says, let's take a look and see, let's take a look and answer your question, basically, authoritatively, instead of just based on the evidence that was put before me.
Will the chairman yield?
Yes, Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Chairman, one of the things that I have an issue with in the language is we direct or we ask the Secretary of Defense to take into account standards at care at facilities administered by the Federal Bureau of Prisons in determining that care. I don't think that's the proper standard.
Why not?
And I also think that we start attaching certain things to them. We change them from a detainee and start giving them the same status as Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Kelly. Just out of,
So just the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
reclaiming my
Yes, sir.
time. Just out of curiosity, what should be the difference in the standard of health care that we give to inmates that we have convicted of crimes and locked up in the United States versus the standard of care that we should be given to people who are being locked up as law of war detainees?
I think because some of the rights that attach when you come to the United States.
They're not coming to the United States. They're in Gitmo.
But when you start talking about standards of care, and if they get the right to go to a facility at the Federal Bureau of Prisons that's outside of the prison thing.
If I may, just for clarification point, this section of the bill that you are striking does not give them the right to come into the U.S. It merely attempts to say, let's look at the standard of care that we currently have at federal prisons and see if it is matched by the standard of care that we have at Gitmo. We ain't transferring them anywhere under this section.
And to be clear, and this language does not give them any rights that the prisoners under the Federal Bureau. It just compares them to, but does not give them any rights.
That is my interpretation, and I'm pretty sure that's exactly what it says.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Further discussion on the amendment? All those in favor will say aye. Opposed? No. No. Opinion share the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider log 285. Mr. Walls, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will pass out the amendment. Without objection, reading is dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment seeks to strike Section 1033, which is a prohibition on the use of funds for transfer and detention of additional individuals to the United States Naval Station Guantanamo Bay, to Gitmo. Section 1033 would, which is the language this amendment seeks to strike, Section 1033 would prohibit detention or transfer of any additional individuals under the law of war or pursuant to a military commission proceeding, except those at Gitmo as of May 2018. So basically going forward, no additional individuals can come into Guantanamo. It would also require the Attorney General to provide a plan within 60 days identifying a disposition other than continued law of war detention at Gitmo for each individual currently detained at Gitmo. So here are my issues. Here are our issues with Section 1033. The concern is that essentially this is a backdoor Gitmo closure. And although there are currently no known plans to transfer new detainees to Gitmo, the option should not be taken off the table in order to be able to respond to emergent requirements. So currently, I could tell you downrange, where we have special operators in 60 to 70 countries tonight as we speak, they are presented with a series of bad options. Either they are forced to detain individuals on the battlefield, which they cannot do as operational units. As we've discussed, they're forced to release them to the local national judicial system, which is often non-existent, which is essentially a catch and release program. We have some type of creative solution, such as putting them on ships, which is not sustainable, or they can come to Guantanamo. This language would prohibit them coming to Guantanamo, so essentially our operational forces would have nowhere to reasonably and responsibly put these detainees. The other issue in requiring the Attorney General to submit a plan identifying a disposition other than law of war detention is essentially then preventing the government from holding these detainees because, as we've discussed, 30 of the current 40 detainees are held under law of war detention. Now, we all know the Obama administration, and President Obama, on day one of his administration sought to close and ordered his administration to close Guantanamo Bay. And after 8 years, as the president's #1 and first priority, they were unable to transfer all law of war detainees, and they, after exhausting every effort, and then held those remaining detainees under law of war detention. We really have no other choice, and in fact, I'll close with this. Just a few days ago, on June 10th, 2019, the Supreme Court rejected a challenge to the indefinite detention of law of war detainees that we are now going to ask the Attorney General to find an alternative to, an alternative that the Obama administration was not able to do, an alternative that the Bush administration was not able to do, and an alternative that the Supreme Court just recently rejected. So again, this amendment seeks to strike that language. We need the operational flexibility to accept more detainees to Guantanamo. It's the least bad option after many, many years of trying to find other options. And the option that the language is directing the Attorney General to provide is essentially non-existent. I yield my time.
Before I respond to this one, I would ask unanimous consent at this point, if people are okay with limiting the time now to 2 minutes in terms of comments. Is there objection to limiting to 2 minutes comments?
Reserving the right to object, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
That would mean proponents of an amendment only have 2 minutes to explain the amendment?
Yeah. And opponents would too.
I object.
Okay. Mr. Thornberry suggested we have 1 5-minute speech on each side, but that's, I don't know, I think probably more than one person might want to speak on some of the stuff that we got coming up.
Well, if the chairman would yield, my point was we've got several Gitmo amendments, several border amendments, and I kind of figured everybody could play in there or yield to each other within the 5-minute time.
Nah, okay. I'll take a stab at Mr. Thornberry's. The rule would be 5 minutes on one side, 5 minutes on the other. You can divide it up however you want. Is there objection to that? Okay. They're pretty close to broken at this point, I think. They'll agree to anything, Mac. All right. Yielding myself the time on this last one. I mean, there's a fundamental fallacy in there are no options. And the big fallacy here is you can do law of war detention in the United States of America. Okay, there is no reason you cannot. We've done it before. We did it in World War II. You do not have to have them in Guantanamo, which is an extraordinarily, as Ms. Sherrill pointed out, unbelievably expensive place to house them. And I want everyone to remember the history here. The reason we used Guantanamo was because we thought, incorrectly as it turned out, that if they were in Guantanamo, the Constitution wouldn't apply. Well, there were several Supreme Court decisions where it was made clear, and this, by the way, is why they don't get any new rights when they're transferred to the United States. The courts ruled you get habeas corpus, you get your constitutional rights, even in Guantanamo. That's why we have the law of war detention. It doesn't change anything. It's just a lot less expensive. Now, the primary argument that has been used, which I view as largely political, to say that, oh gosh, we can't possibly take them out of Guantanamo, is these people are just too dangerous. Well, as Ms. Sherrill has pointed out, if the United States of America is incapable of holding dangerous people so that they are not a threat to the community, then we're all in a whole hell of a lot of trouble. Because in the United States of America, we have murderers, rapists, pedophiles, and yes, some of the worst terrorists you can imagine being held in the U.S. safely and protecting the community. There is no reason to keep Guantanamo open at this point other than for the political point. Whatever we have here, I personally think we should use the Article III courts to prosecute these people so that we do it cleanly and we don't wind up with a situation like Guantanamo. But if you can't, if you want to go law of war detention, no reason. You can't do it in the United States of America. So I disagree and urge opposition to this particular amendment. And forgive me for a moment, I've got to look at something here. Now, yeah. And this particular portion of it is about putting new people into, there's no need to put any more people into the most expensive detention facility we have in the world. We have plenty of domestic options. So I urge opposition to this amendment. Further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor will say aye. Opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. All right, next up is, where are we at? We're moving up and down the line here. Okay. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, recorded vote is requested, and we'll do that near the end. It's now in order to consider Log 255. Mr. Burns, for what purpose do you seek recognition? And the clerk will pass out the amendment without objection. The reading will be dispensed with. Mr. Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. Every year since fiscal year 2011, this committee has carried a provision that prohibits the transfer or release of Guantanamo Bay detainees to the United States. I was interested to see that this same language was not included in the chairman's mark, and that's why I'm offering that previous provision as an amendment. While I'm pleased to see that the chairman included a prohibition on the transfer or release of Guantanamo Bay detainees to Libya, Somalia, Syria, or Yemen, we should include a prohibition on the transfer of these dangerous terrorists to the United States. Let's take a minute to remember that the 40 detainees remaining in Guantanamo are 9/11 architects, Osama bin Laden bodyguards, and al-Qaeda operatives. These are bad people who wish to do harm to people in the United States and would do it again if given the opportunity. This has been a bipartisan issue in the past, and I hope it remains bipartisan today with a yes vote on this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. I will be brief as well. No one is talking about releasing them into the United States. The transfer restrictions on Somalia have to do with people who have been, again, deemed eligible for release. This is the argument I made just a minute ago, so I won't repeat it at any length. We can hold these people in the United States of America far more cost effectively and in a way that the international community is not thrilled with Guantanamo for the reason that it was set up in the first place. That it was set up to try to get around the Constitution. It does, we've had many generals testify throughout the years, that it does undermine cooperation with allies, the possibility that they may be sent to Guantanamo, which has a horrible international reputation, and there's no need for it. We can hold them here in the United States of America under the exact same set of laws that we hold them in Guantanamo. Nobody's talking about releasing them. So I urge opposition to the amendment for that reason.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I want to dispute two things, Mr. Chairman. When the trials were proposed to be held in New York City back in 2010, New York City estimated that their security, they didn't want to just throw them in jail, city jail. They wanted special security given the threat that they would pose to radicalizing other inmates or people trying to spring them from jail, perhaps. They wanted to cover all those contingencies. New York City estimated that it would cost $200 million.
Reclaim my time for just a quick minute. You're aware that colleague, I forget the names, Ramzi Youssef, the Blind Sheikh, a whole lot of very bad terrorists are currently held in the United States in prisons.
Yeah, and
at a much less cost.
And I'm going to get to that in a second.
Okay.
But the cost to New York City is a lot more than keeping Guantanamo open. And I doubt if New York City's alone in that. So
yeah, if I could reclaim my time just one quick second. In New York City, they were talking about the cost of trying them and going through the court proceedings in New York City, taking them back and forth to court every day. That's not what we're talking about here. These people are being held under law of war detention. We're talking about the mere ability to transfer and hold them here. Trials is a more complicated discussion. I'll grant you that. But
that's true, but I don't think you'd have city or states that would want to just use existing facilities. They'd want to beef up those facilities.
Well, what?
And I know that because I have Supermax in my district.
Yeah, so do I. Well, actually, no, I don't. I have a federal
I have
prison. It's not a
the
super-
most secure federal prison in the country
So I guess the
in my
question is,
district. And they don't, the people there, the guards, the families of the guards, they don't want these terrorists from Guantanamo Bay in their community.
Got it. Reclaim
It's
my
a
time for
security
just a
threat.
second. We already have well north of 300 terrorists being held in the United States of America right now in these communities. And there's some pretty bad people. Now, I'll grant you, there are a lot of people down of the 40 down in Guantanamo who are pretty bad as well.
They're the worst of the worst.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that you get much worse than Ramzi Youssef. You know, certainly in terms of the number of Americans he was trying to kill. We are able to hold these terrorists in the United States. We got 40 more. It simply doesn't make sense that we can't safely hold 40 more in addition to the hundreds that we currently hold. It doesn't make sense.
Mr. Chairman.
It is my time, but I'm happy to yield.
Okay, I'll ask for more time here. People in a community like Florence, Colorado, do not want these people in their community. They would pose a hazard to their family members who work inside the prison.
Just out of curiosity, does the gentleman have evidence that the terrorists that we are holding now, I have not seen the stories about all of these problems, about people in communities say, you got to get this guy out of here. What's he doing in this prison? It's terrible for our community.
The people at Guantanamo, Mr. Chairman, are in a special category. There's a lot of them, and they're bad actors.
There's 40 of them, and we hold, well, we've gone back and forth often this enough. I think everybody understands both of our points.
And one other thing, Mr. Chairman, the threat of radicalizing other inmates would be a growing threat within our country. So it wouldn't just be a stable, plateaued situation. It could be potentially much worse in the future.
All right, I'm done with my time. Anybody else? Hearing none, all those in favor, I'm sorry, Mr. Kelly, I looked at you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. There are so many issues with bringing these. And first of all, the people who are here in the Federal Bureau of Prisons or who are here, the terrorists that are here, were already here and committed acts and crimes here. The majority of those committed
If the gentleman
crimes.
will yield for just a second.
Yes.
It's not actually true. A fair number of these terrorists did in fact commit terrorist acts elsewhere and were convicted of committing them and locked up here.
So,
Just saying.
and so those people are not. They are not. They have not been on this soil, or if they have, that's not where they were captured and detained. The second is many of those, not some of them, are different levels of threat. These men in Guantanamo have the ability to command or get armies or large numbers of people to do their bidding. So the facilities here, I think, have to have upgrades. But the point is while they are down there at Gitmo, They are under the laws of war, the detention laws of war, not criminal acts. And we know there's trials. And when you start blurring those lines and bringing people here, and we have a wonderful Constitution that guarantees rights to American citizens and other people who are in America who are not citizens, and we fight over the constitutionality and which applies to which and all those things. What I do know is this: we don't have those arguments if they never set foot on U.S. soil. And I don't want to take American lives and put them at risk at the bidding that a court somewhere will rule they get certain constitutional or criminal or
Will the
immigration
gentleman yield
rights
for
or
just
anything
one
else.
quick second? You're
Yes,
an
sir.
attorney. You're familiar with the decisions around Guantanamo that basically said that the inmates at Guantanamo have the rights afforded by the U.S. Constitution because Guantanamo is effectively U.S. territory because we hold it. They don't get any more rights if they come to the U.S.
Unless they come out from under the Law of War Detention Act, and then all of a sudden, because we started talking about Federal Bureau of Prisons, remember in the ones earlier, but when we talk about Federal Bureau of Prisons, when you start attaching things, then maybe all of a sudden they're no longer declared under the laws of war, Mr. Chairman, but now we start looking at them under the Federal Bureau of Prison or as a criminal as opposed to a war act. And so that's my precautions of why I don't think it is good to, in any case, bring them to the United States of America.
All right. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion share, the noes have it.
Ask roll call vote.
Roll call vote is requested. Moving on. Did we just do, yes, okay. Log 151, Mr. Banks. For what purpose?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will distribute without objection. Reading is dispensed with. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp has proven itself to be an invaluable resource throughout the global war on terrorism. Some of my colleagues would lead you to believe that the cost of Guantanamo Bay is prohibitively expensive and the intelligence gathered is not significant enough to continue funding these facilities. However, let me assure you that this could not be further from the truth. Gitmo criminals have proven to have valuable intelligence for counterterrorism operations. High-value detainees simply cost more than most incarcerated Americans. That's a fact. It is illogical to compare these drastically different groups of criminals and the facilities it requires to house them. We do not need to build a new facility to house these detainees when these secure structures already exist at Guantanamo Bay. My amendment prohibits the use of funds to construct or modify facilities in the United States to house individuals currently detained at Guantanamo. Building a similar facility in the United States would be a wasteful use of taxpayer dollars. These provisions should not be controversial, as this language has been carried unamended in each annual NDAA since FY 2011. And many of you have voted for this language many times before. In conclusion, I urge you to support my amendment prohibiting funds to construct or modify similar facilities in the United States. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. I oppose this amendment as well for all of the reasons that I've stated at this point, so I will not restate them. But I urge opposition for, we've had the basic Guantanamo debate. You understand the arguments. And it is true, this has been carried in the bill, and I've objected to it every single year, unsuccessfully to this point. I'm hoping it's a new day. Any further discussion? All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed will say no. 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 Opinion the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote is requested. We will have a recorded vote. We are now on to log 250, Mr. Rogers.
The desk.
Clerk will distribute. Without objection, reading will be dispensed with. Mr. Rogers, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's common knowledge we have a crisis at our border. Not just a humanitarian crisis, but a crisis in the massive numbers that are coming across our border. It's the last 3 months, we've had in excess of 100,000 migrants per month that were detained. In March, it was 101,000. April, it was 109,000. In May, it was 144,000 migrants. this is going to continue to escalate. Now, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Venezuela are all part of this illicit pathway to our southern border. Civil unrest in Venezuela is driving displaced workers into these migrant paths. Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are all hotbeds of migrant smuggling. Folks cross our border. And we know terrorists have long wanted to exploit illegal immigration into the United States. So releasing hardened radicals into our country with smuggling routes is asking for trouble. So all my amendment says is that if somebody is deemed at Guantanamo Bay to be appropriate for release, they cannot be released into any one of these countries in Central America or South America that have these illicit pathways into our country. And with that, I will urge favorable vote and yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Escobar. Oh, gosh. But if Ms. Escobar could yield for just 1 minute, I want to alert members we possibly have a substitute amendment vote coming up, so we're going to have to get people back here if possible so we can work on that. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to offer a substitute amendment.
The gentlelady is recognized. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I believe we have it. Without objection, reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleague's amendment alleges that Guantanamo detainees transferred to any of these countries will attempt to enter the United States illegally overland and that it poses a security risk to the United States. There is zero proof that any terrorists have ever come in through the southern border or that what my colleague is alleging has ever occurred. That's why I feel an attempt to blacklist these countries is at best premature and at worst unfounded. As the HASC membership well knows, negotiating these transfers is a delicate balance. We should not limit our options by further blacklisting a whole slate of countries based on generalizations not rooted in evidence. We've heard countless times today that many issues warrant study before legislation is appropriate, and this is one of those issues. My amendment would do just that. This amendment would require a report to Congress on past transfers of Gitmo detainees to these 4 countries, including the date and circumstances of each, and provide real data so that we can accurately assess whether there is, in fact, a security risk, and if so, what it is. It is part of our oversight responsibility to gather a clear assessment of what the security risk is, and from there determine the correct response. Banning an entire group of countries with no information is a bad idea, and one I fear we've seen before. This report would help us focus in and assess what, if any, risk has resulted from transfers to these countries. I encourage my colleagues to support this substitute amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Is there any debate on the substitute amendment? Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Listen, this is knuckleheaded. We don't need a report to tell us you shouldn't release a known terrorist into a country that's got illicit pathways to our country. And by the way, I've been on the Homeland Security Committee since it was established. There have been numerous occasions where terrorists have come through our southern border to get into this country. We have sleeper cells throughout this. Don't shake your head, no. I've been on the committee 16 years. I know what I'm talking about. These folks want to get to our country. They want to get to these sleeper cells so that they can wait to be activated. These are bad actors. We don't need to waste money on a study to tell us don't turn them loose in these countries where there's pathways that are active with massive numbers of people they can get in cloaked by and come into our country. And just a second, an aside, and this is the Jim Cooper and me coming out. Every time we order a report, the Pentagon doesn't write these. They hire some FFRDC to write them, and it winds up costing $1 million. So let's just don't loosely be ordering reports left and right like that doesn't cost us a lot of money. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Any further debate? Seeing none? Okay. If not, the question is on the adoption of the substitute amendment offered by Ms. Escobar. So many as are in favor will say aye. 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 Those opposed? No. The ayes have it, and the substitute amendment is adopted. And ask for a recorded vote. A roll call vote is ordered, and a roll call vote on the substitute amendment will be postponed, or cannot be postponed. I'm sorry. Okay? Please call the roll. We can't.
Chairman
That's why I
Smith.
was going to postpone it, but we can't, so, okay.
Chairman Smith.
All right. Please call the roll. We'll
Chairman Smith.
see everybody coming in.
Chairman Smith votes aye. Mr. Thornberry. No. Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop? No. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Turner? No. Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Cooper? Yes. Mr. Cooper votes yes. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Courtney? Yes. Mr. Courtney votes yes. Mr. Conaway? Mr. Conaway votes no. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes yes. Mr. Lamborn? No. Mr. Lamborn votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Whitman? No. Mr. Whitman votes no. Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks? No. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook? No. Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Carbajal? Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes aye. Dr. Desjardins? Dr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Vella? Mr. Vella votes aye. Dr. Abraham? Dr. Abraham votes no. Mr. Kim? Mr. Kim votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes no. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn votes aye. Mr. Gallagher? Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Cisneros? Mr. Cisneros votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Bacon? Mr. Bacon votes no. Mr. Crow? Mr. Crow votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Ms. Torres-Small? Ms. Torres-Small votes aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney votes no. Ms. Slotkin, sorry. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell? No. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Bergman? No. Mr. Bergman votes no. Ms. Hill? Aye. Ms. Hill votes aye. Mr. Waltz? No. Mr. Waltz votes no. Ms. Escobar? Aye. Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Holland? Aye. Ms. Holland votes aye. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden votes aye. Mrs. Trahan? Aye. Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mrs. Luria? No. Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin? On this vote, the ayes are 28 and the noes are 28.
Mr. Where are we at here? We're now on log number 2.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
It's unfortunate under the circumstances, but it's also brutally unfair, and it's up to the minority. By UC, Mr. Langeman can be allowed to vote, but I'm pretty sure it has to be by UC. I realize we're not supposed to argue about these things, but it's 4 o'clock in the morning. Langeman's in the wheelchair, doing his best. It just doesn't seem right to deny him the right to vote because he couldn't get here that quickly. Decisive vote may be. Be that as it may, it is by UC.
Mr. Chairman, about the inquiry about reconsideration, I mean,
What are the parliamentary rules on reconsideration? She voted.
Mr.
voted?
Parliamentary inquiry, my understanding, though, in a reconsideration, when someone has voted and asked for it to be reconsidered, they have to vote the other way in the revote, which is the whole purpose, which you're going to get mathematically the same outcome.
Well, actually,
Because my understanding is that and that's why the parliamentary
if I
inquiry.
got you, if I could take a stab at this, first of all, I don't believe that is true. I don't think the person who is moving for the reconsideration
I think that's their point of
has
moving.
to change their vote. They have a right.
Otherwise, it would be in perpetuity that everyone
we-
gets to do that. That's not the case.
Well, it wouldn't be in perpetuity. We got the argument is
Right, because anyone can.
I'm sorry. Stop babbling. Let's get an answer. We got parliamentarians here. If you make the motion to reconsider, do you have to change your vote? By the way, if she changed her vote, it would make the reversal even more pronounced, not the other way around.
No, if she changed her vote to yes,
Right.
she would,
But
whatever.
Think of that one.
Whatever.
Think about that one for a second, and then but let's get the parliamentary answer. Apparently, we don't have a handy answer to that, so we're going to get an answer to that. I would really rather not recess, so if you could huddle with the parliamentarians instead of us having a public discussion about it and show them what you've got and see how they react to it, I would not object to that. My request is that we continue on the amendment process and come back to resolve this issue once the parliamentarians on both sides have agreed. Is that okay? All right, so we're going to move forward, and we'll resolve this issue, and we'll come back to it when necessary. So we are now on log 223, Mr. Kelly.
I have an amendment at the desk, Chairman.
And we've already been through this, so Mr. Kelly, you are recognized.
And I'm going to be very brief on this. I thank the chairman again for yielding, and I'm offering this amendment to strike a portion of this report language because it is inappropriate for the GAO to recommend policy changes or legislative action. The chairman's mark presumes that medical care at Gitmo is inadequate. I've been to Gitmo, and that's just not the case. We have the capability to provide whatever specialty care is needed for the detainees. I reemphasize these people do not need to be housed or to be on U.S. soil. Gitmo is the most appropriate and safest place to treat the detainees and protect the American public. I urge support for this amendment, and I yield back.
No, it wasn't. Hold on a second. I would also like to point out, we had a motion, there's a whole lot of things going on here, so let me go through them in order. Number one, we did have a UC motion saying only 5 minutes on either side. We haven't really been paying attention to that. So since that is the current rules, now part of the way we're gonna have to do that is if someone speaks as quickly as Mr. Kelly did, he's still got like 4 minutes left. We're gonna have to keep track of the time even after they relinquish it. There's 5 minutes on each side, if that's possible, so we know how those 5 minutes are. We'll get through them, and if this blows up at some point, we can revisit it. But that's what we're going to try to do. Second, we're going to try to resolve the other thing, but we're working on that at the moment. Lastly, again, I have had evidence that medical care at Guantanamo is not what it should be. It strikes me that studying it is a reasonable thing to do to try to make sure that the health care at Guantanamo is as wonderful as it has been described. So I don't see a problem with this, and I oppose the gentleman's amendment to strike the provision. Any other discussion?
Mr. Chairman, yes, just quickly.
Yes.
Earlier conversations, you were saying that the medical care should comport with federal law or Federal Bureau of Prisons. How did you know that if you didn't have the study? Should you get them both?
Well, it's not a matter of knowing that. In that case, we were trying to get to a standard. So we do know a great deal about the medical care standards in federal prisons. In fact, it's kind of in statute what is required. So we were asking.
But if you're requiring that, why do you need this study?
We didn't require it. We asked that they look at it and try to make it comparable. The study would help inform whether or not it is comparable.
I trust our DOD to be able to make that assessment. If you tell them it's got to be done and comport with the federal prison rules, then our guys are way capable of deciding what's there versus what's that, and I don't know that you need a study to make that happen.
Duly noted. You said your piece, I said mine. We could keep going back and forth forever, but I think we're there. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. All right. Okay, let's do this. Before we try to address the issue of what Robert's Rules of Order are, we're going to get through this amendment by Mr. Lamborn, and then we will see where we're at on the other issue and hopefully resolve that one way or the other. So log 389 is up next, amendment by Mr. Lamborn. For what purposes does he seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and on our screens.
Thank you. The clerk will distribute the amendment without objection. The reading is dispensed with. Mr. Lamborn.
This amendment seeks to restore funding for a high-value detainee building at Guantanamo. The Department of Defense has asked for this, and the majority has struck it out, unfortunately. I think it's a poor decision. I'm going to explain why. Joint Task Force Gitmo has said that the existing facility is unsafe. It's unsafe for the soldiers, our Army soldiers who serve as guards at Gitmo. Quote, the current complex has failed foundations, which has resulted in cracked flooring and uneven settling of walls and doorways. Increasing routine facility failures include inoperable doorways, including cell doors that do not close, broken water supply, and drain lines. And they also say, quote, facilities were not designed and constructed to provide long-term detention, legal counsel, and medical treatment in a consolidated and streamlined method. As a result, the guard force is required to move highly dangerous detainees back and forth between separate facilities. Each detainee movement places guard force members at risk. So Joint Task Force Gitmo has said that the current facility is unsafe for our men and women in uniform who are guarding these dangerous detainees. And think about that for a minute. Think about if you were a prison guard at night and you were making your rounds and there were cell doors that did not close. Would you be a little concerned about your back if people, if their cell doors did not close? That's what Joint Task Force Gitmo has reported. That's the conditions that our men and women, our Army soldiers who guard these detainees are living under right now. So, and a further irony in this situation is that 2 other facilities are being funded by the bill as it stands at this moment. Those 2 buildings are a communications facility for $22 million and a detention legal office and communications center for $11.8 million. So right now in the bill that we're going to vote on, we're funding 2 other buildings to be built at Guantanamo Bay. A communications facility for $22 million and a detention legal office and communication center for $11.8 million. In other words, we're going to build facilities for the reporters and the lawyers, but not for our men and women in uniform who are guarding these people. I think that's embarrassing. How can we live with that? We're building stuff for reporters and lawyers, but not for our guards, our soldiers who are guarding these people. I think that this is a horrible situation. We should fund that 3rd building. I don't even know why it was taken out of consideration. Let's adopt this amendment and put that funding back in for that high detainee facility so our Army soldiers have safe operating conditions. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah. According to our little 5 back and forth thing, you should reserve the balance.
Okay,
of
I'll
time.
reserve
It's about a
myself for others.
minute and 20 seconds.
Thank you.
I yield to Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Chairman, I have a substitute amendment at the desk.
Sorry, just taking a drink of water there. The clerk will distribute the amendment. And without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and Mr. Khanna is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my substitute amendment would require a study on alternatives, near-term facility requirements to house high-value detainees. It requires that this report be completed within 120 days. The department has not yet done its due diligence in assessing alternatives to building an $88.5 million new permanent detention facility. The facility last year was projected to cost $69 million, and both Republicans and Democrats opposed it on a bipartisan basis. We asked similar questions last time about alternatives and haven't yet received any answers. This time, the amendment is seeking a project for $20 million more when we haven't even gotten the answers. Viable alternatives include repair, renovation, and repurposing of existing facilities. DOD has not yet provided a feasibility analysis of alternatives that could adequately meet the requirement to humanely house high-value detainees and ensure safety for military personnel who guard them. Both the Milcon Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee have cut this project out of similar concerns. The proposed complex is not primarily a medical facility, and the extent to which it may or may not enhance the provision of medical care is unclear. Medical care is currently provided to the detainees in multiple facilities, including a health clinic funded in the 2015 NDAA. I reserve my time.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Brown. I believe he has a perfecting amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have a perfecting amendment at the desk.
Is your microphone on?
Oh, sorry. Mr. Chairman, I have a perfecting amendment at the desk.
Sorry. The clerk will distribute the amendment, and without objection, reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Brown.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, my perfected amendment changes the time period in which the Secretary of Defense shall submit the report that is required in the substitute amendment, and it changes it from 120 days to 90 days. I yield back.
Okay. Is
Mr.
there
Chairman? Yes.
further discussion? Mr. Lambert.
Yes, I'd like to start my 5 minutes over again.
Well, you can, because it's a new thing.
Thank you, thank you. Just wanted to make sure. This is really an amazing
You
situation.
do
we're
need
in.
to start the clock. Sorry.
We're in an amazing situation. The Department of Defense, through Joint Task Force Gitmo, has filed a form called a Form 1391. They did this in response to the appropriation request that they're making for these 3 buildings, including the one that right now is being prohibited. This Form 1391 is dated March 1st of 2019. This is a report. This right here in my hands is a report. And the report says, I'm going to quote it, alternative methods of meeting this requirement have been explored during project development. This project is the only feasible option to meet this requirement. Let me repeat that. Alternative methods of meeting this requirement have been explored during project development. This project is the only feasible option to meet the requirement. So if my colleague, Mr. Khanna, wants a report, we've already got it. Why do we need to accept his amendment? We've got the report. And by the way, the report says there's no other way to do this. And on Mr. Brown's amendment, it's a tree, a Christmas tree. I don't know what they call it. It doesn't feel very festive here. But it's to preclude any other amendments from our side.
It's just a tree.
But that's
not...
changing to 120 days to 90 days. Once again, that's moot. That's irrelevant because the report is in our hands. It's right here. We don't need a report. We've got the answer. The answer is this building is the only way to meet this need. So I would urge a no on both of these Christmas tree amendments, or whatever we call them, and a yes on the amendment to actually build the building that will protect our guards holding these high-value, dangerous detainees. This is kind of embarrassing. We shouldn't be having this discussion. I yield back.
Is there further discussion? If not, the question occurs first on Mr. Brown's perfecting amendment, and the clerk will call the roll. I was presumptuous. I apologize. I was assuming a recorded vote. All those in favor of Mr. Brown's perfecting amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion share, the ayes have it. Yeah. Okay. All right. The ayes have it. We're down to 90 days. Now we're on to Mr. Khanna's amendment, substitute amendment. All those in favor of Mr. Khanna's substitute amendment will say aye. 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 Opposed will say no. No. Opinion share, the ayes have it. A recorded vote is called for. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith. Aye. Chairman Smith votes aye. Mr. Thornberry. No. Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin. Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Larson. Aye. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Turner. No. Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Pardon me. Mr. Lambourne. Mr. Lambourne votes no. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes no. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Carbajal?
Aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves? Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes aye. Dr. Desjardins? Dr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Vella? Mr. Vella votes aye. Dr. Abraham? Dr. Abraham votes no. Mr. Kim? Mr. Kim votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes no. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn votes aye. Mr. Gallagher? Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Cisneros? Mr. Cisneros votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Bacon? Mr. Bacon votes no. Mr. Crow? Mr. Crow votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Ms. Torrey Small? Ms. Torrey Small votes aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney votes no. Ms. Slotkin? Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes no. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman votes no. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill votes aye. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz votes no. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes aye. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden votes aye. Ms. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mrs. Luria? Mrs. Luria votes aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes no.
All members recorded? Any members change their votes?
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 31 and the noes are 26.
Is adopted. It is now in order to consider Mr. Lambert's amendment as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. It's the same vote. They are on the record. They are very much on the record. I mean, if you want it, it's your privilege, but back me up here, people. It's the same vote we just took. Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, it is now in order to consider on block package number 4. I ask unanimous consent to call up on block package number 4, consisting of inmates, amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority. Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will distribute the on block amendments. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. On block package number 4 is comprised of the following. Log number 433R1, 481R1, 216, 277R2, 431R1, 373R1, 357R1, 029R2, 242R1, 021R3, 341R1, 436R1, 056, 471, 140R2, 022R1, and 478. Is there discussion on the en bloc amendments? Hearing none, all those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say no. The en blocs are adopted. It is now in order to consider log 349R1 by Mr. Garamendi. For what purpose does Mr. Garamendi seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, reading will be dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to do this very quickly. We have involved ourselves in Iraq and Syria for the last 3 years, successfully defeating ISIS on the battlefield. Unfortunately, ISIS is still around, and the problem persists as to what to do with the remnants of ISIS, as well as the reconstruction and renewal of life in both Syria and Iraq. This amendment provides direction to the U.S. military about what it can do. It follows very closely on plans that have already been made. It instructs the military to work with the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, to enact a plan. Essentially, the activity of the military would be to train and equip the security forces and to provide protection and security for the American organizations and government operations in both Iraq and Syria for the reconstruction. That's it. It's what we really ought to be doing, and we really ought to have had a waiver from the Foreign Affairs Committee. I don't need to go into all the trouble we've had before, but since we do not have a waiver, this will come up on the floor. I yield back.
Next is log 245 by Mr. Rogers. For what purpose does Mr. Rogers seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will distribute. I think we need to update these things because that was always when you actually had to distribute it. Without objection, the clerk, we will dispense with the reading of the amendment, and Mr. Rogers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be as brief as I can because I think everybody's got their lines drawn when it comes to these border bills. The underlying bill prohibits any money being spent by the DOD for the construction of border barriers. As I said, I've been on the Homeland Security Committee since it was established. We have never had a difference of opinion on party lines as to the effectiveness of barriers at the border. In fact, the San Diego fence, when it was built in 1992, we've seen a 92% drop over the last 23 years in migrants coming across. El Paso, built in 93, we've seen a 95% over 22 years. Tucson, built in 2000, illegal traffic dropped 90%. Yuma, built in 2005, illegal traffic dropped 95%. Barriers work. We need to have these barriers erected so we can stop this flow I described earlier, these massive number of people coming across our border. I think it's irresponsible for us to block this funding, and I urged a adoption of my amendment to allow the President to move forward in his building of the barrier.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I will yield.
Just to add a couple points there, Congress has not acted to fund this, so the administration has had no choice but to send troops and to try to find funds to make some borders in effect. And I think that we have no choice but to let that happen unless Congress actually takes action to address the problem at the crisis at the border. Even the New York Times a few days ago on the 9th of June editorialized in May, 144,278 migrants were taken into custody. It was the third consecutive month in which apprehensions topped 100,000 and the highest one-month total in 13 years. Unequipped to deal with the crush, border facilities and migrant shelters are dangerously overcrowded, and the staff is overburdened. Dysfunction, disease, and even death are a growing reality. And then they conclude by saying, while lawmakers wring their hands and drag their feet, tens of thousands of migrant children are suffering. Congress needs to get serious about dealing with that suffering. Why can't we do something? Why can't we do something? This amendment at least lets the administration make stopgap measures until we can get our act together and have a long-range solution. So please support this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And in keeping with, actually, it's Mr. Rogers'
I reserve.
time.
I reserve to Mr. Rogers.
So there's about 2 minutes and 14
Yield back to
seconds
Mr.
left on their side. On our side, we start now. I'm going to say something quickly. There is a crisis at the border. I'm not going to say no one disputes that. Maybe some people do, but I think it's pretty clear that there's a crisis at the border. What we dispute is that spending billions of dollars to build a wall is going to address that crisis. The migrants that Mr. Lamborn just referenced weren't trying to sneak in. They turned themselves in. The overwhelming majority of the population that is now the crisis at the border, children, women, migrants who we cannot house or adequately take care of, are not trying to sneak across. It is an unbelievable waste of resources to address this crisis to spend that money on a wall. The crisis is in dealing with the people who are coming across the border. So that's our complaint and our disagreement. Second, it's DHS, not DOD. This money should not come out of the Department of Defense, as, by the way, a lot of my Republican colleagues said when this first came up. So those are the two issues, not disputing the crisis. And with that, I yield to Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I represent El Paso, Texas, which has essentially been the eye of the storm. There has been no other district that has seen more migrants coming across. In fact, there are two of us here at this dais who represent the sector that has been the most impacted by what is happening at the southern border. There are two of us who live in the El Paso sector for whom safety and security could not be more important because we live there. We live there and we represent constituents who live there. The reality is, in El Paso, where the numbers are the highest along the southern border, there is a wall. The crisis is a humanitarian one, and the people being apprehended are being apprehended at the wall because the wall does not exist on the dividing line between the United States and Mexico. It, in fact, exists yards away and, in some cases, miles away. So by the time migrants have come across and reached the wall, they have long been on American soil. They are actually waving down Border Patrol agents asking to be apprehended. There is no one who wants to solve this more than the people who live and represent the border. A wall is not a solution. Happy to work with anyone on a solution. DOD is not a solution. A wall is not a solution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yield to Mr. Gallego.
I yield to Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Representative Escobar. I understand that my friends support President Trump's border wall. Every member here knows where I stand on that issue. However, I don't speak in opposition to my friend's amendment as much as I speak in support of the integrity of this committee, this Congress, and the clear separation of powers outlined in our Constitution. Last Congress, I offered amendments to the NDA and to several appropriation bills to ensure that our military funding would not be misused for border wall construction. I was assured by my Republican colleagues at that time that my amendments were totally unnecessary, since Congress didn't appropriate $1 for the wall. And as we all know, the President could not build his wall if Congress didn't fund it. That's Constitution 101. Well, my Republican colleagues were right and wrong. The Republican Party had unified control of government for 2 years, but Congress unilaterally rejected President Trump's request to fund a wall, and they were right about that. But even though Congress never appropriated $1 for Trump's border wall, that didn't stop the President from flipping the Constitution on its head and trying to steal $7 billion from our military for his wall. There are members of this committee who support constructing a border wall. I'm not here to argue that position, although I do oppose it and believe that we could win on the merits of this issue. Rather, I'm here to echo what my great friend, Ranking Member Thornberry, who said, I fully support doing more at the border, but we don't need to rob the military, as he said last year. I will remind my friends that this is the House Armed Services Committee. Our job is to stand up for the people, for the armed forces, for our service members, and for their families, not use them as pawn for partisan political fights.
I urge my colleagues in the strongest terms to oppose this amendment, which undermines our effort to ensure that every single penny authorized in this bill is spent for the benefit of our troops, for the national defense, and for nothing else. I yield back my time.
All right, that pretty much exhausts the time on this side of the issue. There's about, I forget what they got left, about 2 minutes and 15 seconds on the other side. I think the way we're going to have to do this is sort of like we do it on the floor. We'll have one person on each side control the time and yield it to people. And on this amendment, Mr. Rogers, Mr. Rogers, you're controlling the time. You have 2 minutes and 14 seconds left. Okay. All right. All those in favor of the amendment by Mr. Rogers will say aye. Aye. Opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote is requested. We will have a recorded vote. It is now in order to consider log 247, also by Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers seeks recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment will be distributed and reading will be waived. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. This has to do with restoring national emergency authority that's been limited by the underlying bill. And what has happened is the majority has put language in that would basically allow environmental lawyers, activists, to be able to file litigation to prohibit, to stop the president from trying to erect a wall, any kind of using military construction money. Again, this goes to the same issue. We need to start building barriers at the wall. We don't need to start throwing impediments in front of the administration, particularly when it comes to just litigation. So I would urge the adoption of this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you. And claiming the time in opposition, if we'll do it that way. It will just say, quickly on this, this is actually an issue that goes beyond the wall. And it's been bipartisan in the sense that when there's a Democratic president, the Republicans do not like the power the executive exercises, and when there's a Republican administration, Democrats don't like it. But there has been a massive expansion of the emergency powers that have been granted to the executive to basically push the legislative branch aside. The emergency powers are meant to be far narrower than they've been interpreted by many administrations, but certainly by this one. It's not just this issue, but on tariffs and a bunch of other things. So I think it's a really important issue to rein in the emergency powers. We have a process, and if the president has a proposal, he comes to Congress, we work it out. We should not override the congressional body in this manner, and therefore I oppose the amendment, and I will now yield to Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say that all members on this committee are supporters of the armed services. They know that the work we do here is supposed to enable those services to defend our nation. One thing that the armed services is not supposed to do, Mr. Chairman, is to build a wall on the southern border. They're certainly not supposed to do that when we haven't given them the authority or the money to do it. This amendment strikes language that was put into the mark because of the recent unconstitutional raid by this administration on our military. As we all know, the administration declared a national emergency, stole money from military construction accounts, and tries to use it to build a wall over the objections of this committee and its power of the purse. Every member of this committee should be concerned about that. Because of that huge breach of trust, we have to impose sensible limits. And that's what this amendment does. It limits expenditures for natural emergencies to $500 million or $100 million if it's entirely within the United States. Congress can always appropriate more emergency spending during a crisis if it so chooses. It makes sure that you can't cancel projects for the specific purpose of stealing the money for a presidential vanity project under any administration. It makes sure that other parts of the law must be respected rather than they get tossed out by someone who is more interested in creating a building, instead of creating a building and fulfilling a promise, than a much-needed airstrip in a war zone, ensuring that a pumping station is functional, or any other type of emergency military construction that was built with this authority back when we could trust that the President and the Secretary of Defense to be responsible with what we appropriate. Stripping it out does nothing to solve our national debate over the border, but it would handicap our constitutional role, our readiness, and the confidence that when we, the people's representatives, order something, that it means something. I encourage my friends on this committee to remember their oaths to the Constitution, as they join me in voting down this amendment and voting in favor of the safety and security of troops and the radical principle of using Department of Defense dollars for Department of Defense priorities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. I reserve the balance of my time. Anyone else seek recognition on this? If not, all those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will say no.
No.
See, we're picking up over here. I expect that. The noes have it, depending on the chair.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Recorded vote will be ordered. And it is now, I'm sorry, did we just do 247? Yes, sir. Okay, it is now in order to consider log 244, also by Mr. Rogers. For what purposes, Mr. Rogers?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will distribute the amendment, and reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have in my hand a letter that was sent to the Congress 2 days ago by the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Acting Secretary of Homeland Security. I'd ask to be submitted to the record without objection.
Without objection, so ordered.
And the letter just basically explains how dire the crisis is, and the Secretary of HHS is telling us that in 2 weeks they're running out of money. So they're not going to have any place to put these unaccompanied children that they have in massive numbers. So we need to give them some help. But one of the things that the administration's been doing heretofore, while we were waiting on Congress to act, and Congress has refused, is we've been sending resources down there, mainly in the form of manpower, to do administrative functions to relieve Border Patrol agents to try to deal with the folks and keep them safe and healthy. The underlying bill takes away the authority for the administration, to any administration, to be able to send troops to the border to function in that support capacity. Now, I want everybody to understand, we have been sending DOD assets to the border since the Alamo. It's been happening every decade. You just go back in recent memory, President Clinton sent troops down there repeatedly, George W. Bush sent troops down there repeatedly, Obama sent troops down there repeatedly, and Trump has. We have to do it in order to keep our borders secure and to deal with things like the humanitarian crisis. All my amendment does is it restores the border assistance authority that exists in a current law into the bill, and I would urge adoption of my amendment.
Mr. Gallego. I rise in opposition to this amendment. Number one, just for historical context, when the Alamo occurred, there was no American forces. That was Texans fighting Mexicans. So just kind of want to correct that. But number two, we have a problem at the border that should be fixed through the appropriate process, which is through HHS funding, DHS funding. There are packages that are moving through the House right now. The reason we are instituting a lot of these breaks is because there was a particular move by this administration to strip money and, more importantly, strip our powers of oversight on this committee. And this is why we are instituting a lot of these efforts to make sure that in the future, when there are true emergencies, they have to come and consult with us instead of just trying to steal the money for things that we have appropriated and authorized. I'll yield back my time. Thank you. And I'm sorry, who seeks recognition? Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the amendment. Look, the chairman's mark maintains the ability for the department, for the military, to assist with aerial surveillance, intelligence analysis, and logistics support. We've seen at a high water mark 7,000 troops at the border. I think today there are 5,000 between active and reserves. What we're requiring in this section is that the DOD being reimbursed for these costs. Through the end of this fiscal year, it's projected or estimated to cost the DOD $1 billion. Think about it. Later this evening, we're going to have a debate or discussion or an effort to increase the mark by $17 billion. 6% of that $17 billion is being spent at the border for a job that DHS ought to be doing. So the mark just says, reimburse the DOD for the support they're providing you. That's consistent with everyone's concern that the DOD needs to be sufficiently funded. We do a few other things by requiring the DOD to certify readiness. We do that because in response, for example, to the Marine Corps Commandant's comment that the border mission is an unacceptable risk to combat readiness. And we're also asking the department to show us how the the skills of those deployed soldiers aligns with the missions that they're asked to do. And that's important because we know that soldiers are on the border, sailors and Marines, painting the wall, shoveling manure, and fixing cars. So we're asking for a report, we're asking for reimbursement. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further discussion on this amendment?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I yield such time as you may consume to my friend from Georgia.
I want to read a little bit from the CIA's page on Mexico. Major drug producing and transit nation. Mexico is estimated to be the world's third largest producer of opium, with poppy cultivation in 2015 estimated to be 28 hectares, yielding a potential production of 475 metric tons of raw opium. The government conducts the largest independent illicit crop eradication program in the world, continues the primary transshipment country for U.S.-bound cocaine from South America, with an estimated 95% of annual cocaine movements toward the U.S. stopping in Mexico. Major drug syndicates control the majority of drug trafficking through the country, producing distributors of ecstasy, a significant money laundering center, major supplier of heroin, and the largest foreign supplier of marijuana and methamphetamines to the U.S. markets. I would just remind you, we lose more Americans to drug overdoses in a month than we have lost to terrorism in the last decade. And so, as much as I wish we didn't need our military at the border, if we're honest, we need to stop the flow of illegal drugs into the country, and this may be the only way to do it. With that, I yield the remainder of my time back to Mr. Rogers.
I have nothing further.
Say no. No. Pity and show the noes have it. We'll have a recorded vote on this one as well. And we are now on to log 229R1 from Ms. Hartzler. For what purpose does Ms. Hartzler seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Reading is dispensed with. Ms. Hartzler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to take us all back to the year 1990. That's when we were working on the NDAA. I wasn't here, but we had a Democratic-controlled House and Senate. And they passed a very important bill at that time that allows the Department of Defense to provide for the construction of roads and fences and installation of lighting for the purpose of to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries of the United States, unquote. This is a large piece of legislation that this committee several years ago passed in order to go after the drug cartels and to the counter-drug operations. My amendment today restores DOD's ability to build fences for counter-drug activities. That has been the law of the land since 1990, and in the underlying bill, they removed this provision of Section 284. And I think we can all agree that this is an area that needs to stay in our current law. The Department of Defense needs to be able to help take on this real threat to our country, because we not only have wars abroad, afar, we also have a war on drugs. In 2017 alone, we lost 70,000 Americans to drug overdoses. Now, that is more than during the entire time during the Vietnam War. It is devastating, and 90% of the heroin that is coming into the United States comes across the southern border from the drug cartels. They aren't backing off. The drug cartels are ramping up. Over the last 2 years, we've seen a 73% increase in fentanyl, 38% increase in methamphetamine coming across the border, 22% increase in heroin seized. And in last year, the Customs and Border Patrol seized enough cocaine to fill more than 141 one-ton pickup trucks. They caught more fentanyl, 1,847 pounds of fentanyl. That's enough to kill 418 million people, and that's more than the entire population of the United States. But these numbers aren't just statistics. They are played out in the lives of individuals in our district. I've had individuals in Missouri and families I've gotten to know that have lost children to the heroin, to the war on drugs. But there's other lives that have been lost to this horrific epidemic. There's Cameron Weiss, 18 years old, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who died of a heroin overdose. There's Madison McDonald, a 15-year-old girl from Marlton, New Jersey, who was found dead in her bedroom the day after Christmas in 2017 with a bag of heroin cut with fentanyl next to her. There's Caitlin Sterling of Saxis, Virginia, who died at the age of 20 from a heroin addiction. Each of us in this room has been impacted by the drug epidemic in our nation, and it's irresponsible to limit DOD's ability to effectively conduct drug interdiction. The Constitution clearly states it is our duty to provide for the common defense. For our forefathers, initially that meant our immediate borders. We have a responsibility to defend our nation from deadly drugs that is taking the lives of our citizens. Our predecessors understood this, and that's why they expanded the Department of Defense's role in previous NDAAs. This epidemic requires a whole of government approach, which includes the military. And so I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to allow us to be able to keep this very, very important tool to keep our constituents safe, to allow the Department of Defense to continue to target the drug cartels and to counter those, and to be able to provide and build fences and construction of roads, if need be, to block off the drug corridors that are taking the lives ultimately of our citizens. And so with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I, too, wasn't here in 1990. But even as an 11-year-old, I can tell the difference of why then that bill was justified and why it's no longer justified now. Then it went through an appropriate oversight committee hearing. It came through HASC. It was appropriated. We functioned as the accountability check on the presidency. What we have seen now with this particular section is that it is the Trojan horse that is being used essentially to funnel the DOD money that we've appropriated and authorized to this border wall and other efforts. Now, what we are consistently saying here is that if there is a way to do this, we should go through the proper process. What we're saying in this committee, or at least on this side, was that the president has abused a system that was set up for true emergencies. Now, if you believe that this is an emergency to the extent that this president's saying, then he should actually go through the appropriations process. What we have in this mark actually allows a certain level of funding to be used. As we noted, $100 million entirely within the United States, $500 million outside the borders. And if there's more needed, then he should do what our forefathers always thought, so that we should be part of that process, and we should have the power of the purse to determine how taxpayers' money is best used. Unfortunately, what we've seen so far is that this particular section, 10 U.S.C. 284, has been particularly abused by this administration and has been the funnel from where most of this money has been going through. So that's why I ask all committee members to please oppose this amendment. And I yield back to I yield my time to Representative Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego. You very correctly pointed out the abuse that the administration is involved in circumventing the appropriation power of Congress. I do want to speak to the issue of the flow of drugs into the United States. Some members of this committee are also on the Transportation Infrastructure, the Maritime Subcommittee. A hearing took place here in the T&I committee room. The information provided is that the drugs from Mexico go through the ports of entry. Some smaller amount, a very small proportionate amount, do go through areas outside of the ports of entry, but the great majority, fentanyl, basically by the Postal Service and other delivery services, and cocaine and heroin and marijuana, directly through the ports of entry. So that's one of the places we ought to do it. Also pointed out very, very clearly was the role of the U.S. Coast Guard, which is severely underfunded and is unable to provide more than 16% of the known drugs that are flowing from Colombia into Central America and then from there transported both by water and overland into the United States. So it is incorrect to think that a wall is going to solve the problem. It is correct to spend the money appropriately authorized and appropriated by the Congress for the purposes in the Homeland Defense Agency, not to use a surreptitious route of money that was appropriated and authorized for the Department of Defense for other purposes and then claiming a emergency and then funneling that money into the drug interdiction program. So with that, I yield back the remaining of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 95% of the cocaine in the U.S. comes through Mexico. Largest supplier of meth to the U.S., major supplier of heroin. My colleague is correct that more of it comes through ports of entry than comes across. No, I don't agree with the 80 to 90%. I will concede that more comes through ports of entry. But if we're honest about the Western Hemisphere, what is destroying the governments in Central and South America is the flow of money and weapons to the cartels. We are doing the other countries in the Western Hemisphere a favor by having a secure border in the United States and stopping the flow of illegal drugs to the United States and stopping the flow of money back to the cartels in the Western Hemisphere that are destroying those governments and killing those people. With that, I yield the remainder of my time.
I believe Mr. Gallego has 40 seconds left. Do you wish to use it?
Thank you, Mr. Smith. This is how absurd that this situation we're dealing with. That 284 actually was supposed to use directly for counter drugs, except it was never actually used counter drugs. They actually rated even that fund to actually put it towards the wall. So if you were actually trying to actually deal with the problems of ports of entries, where the majority of the drugs are coming in, then we'd actually use that money to actually put it in the ports of entry, hire more CBP, or hire or do whatever necessary improvements you have to do there. Instead, it's been used for a while. So this is why, again, the best way to actually deal with an emergency of this nature is to actually go through the process, the appropriation process, where we can actually have input and we can actually truly figure out a way to solve this in a bipartisan manner and not through a power grab by the president using powers that we had never, ever given him or never thought any president would ever use. And this is why we have to restrict them, because they have not used their power in an appropriate manner. And I yield back my time.
All right. Question occurs on the amendment by Ms. Hartzler. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed will say no. No. Permanent show the noes have it. Recorded vote is requested, and we'll add that. All right. We're going to, if everyone will bear with me for a moment, I want to give you an update on where we're at and what we're doing. A lot of fast and furious activity have here. We have an amendment by Mr. Crow left. And then we have, I believe, 4 on-block packages. There are 2 issues that we now have an agreement on that we're going to try to include into those on-block packages. If we can't get them in time, they will be handled separately, and that is the launch language, which I think we'll be happy to know we are not going to have a vote on launch language. We have an agreement. Second, and I'll get into this in a minute, the $2.3 billion for the emergency funding, we also have an agreement on, which we're going to be able to accept. And then we'll have a fast and furious 10-minute debate about 750 or 733. Then we will have a series of amendment votes. Do we have a count on how many amendments now we've asked for a vote? A lot is not a precise answer. It is accurate, but it's not 11. And we will likely have at least 1 more. So we'll probably have 12 votes to take at the conclusion in addition to other minutes. So everyone just take a deep breath for the home stretch here. We will now move to log 360R1 from Mr. Crow. For what purpose does Mr. Crow seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment without objection. The reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and Mr. Crow is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment would prohibit the use of Department of Defense funds to house children involuntarily separated from a parent. Now, this is a very simple amendment. I find the policy of forcible child separation particularly abhorrent, and certainly the fact that we did this very recently it will be a moral stain on our country. But more so, or similarly, is the impact on those that are forced to participate in those policies, and the impact on them and their families. You know, the primary purpose of our Department of Defense and our military is to ensure our national security, to train and to fight and win our wars. They should not be pulled into politics. They should not be pulled into policies of this nature. So I believe that this amendment is important to ensure that our uniformed personnel, our men and women, are not pulled into politics. If this administration should decide to reinstitute a child separation policy in the future, we will have that battle in the House of Representatives, and I will certainly fight to prevent that from happening. But what I want to do through this amendment is ensure that our men and women in uniform in the Department of Defense are not a part of that battle, that we are insulating them from those politics, and we will have that battle separate from our men and women in uniform. So I would ask for everyone's support to ensure that we can make that happen.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, since the Trump administration ended the family separation practice months ago, even though it had been carried out the entire 8 years of the Obama administration, I wouldn't really have a problem with this amendment because it's a moot point, but for the fact that at the very end of it, there's a poison pill that I just can't abide. It would allow law enforcement decisions about a child's safety to be overruled by an anonymous, unvetted, uncountable child welfare worker with no law enforcement experience. You know, when we take children away from an adult now, it's because we suspect the adult is not their parent. It's for their safety. Under the way this is written, unless they can find a child welfare worker within 48 hours who can make a decision within 48 hours, we have to put the kid back with the adult we expect is really just somebody that's renting the kid to get into the country. I think this is a dangerous precedent. If that provision wasn't in there, I'm fine with it, but it is in there, and I think we need to vote against this.
Mr. Moulton.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to acknowledge that I was reluctant to support this amendment initially, because there's a bit of hypocrisy here in the sense that just 2 years ago, Mr. Bridenstine on this committee offered an amendment to prohibit housing unaccompanied alien children on U.S. military installations located inside the U.S., and every Democrat on the committee except Mr. Bacon's predecessor voted against it. Ironically, the only Republican to vote no was Mr. Crow's predecessor. But Mr. Crow, in his case here, has included significant exceptions to the amendment that I think are reasonable. Democrats in the past voted against this prohibition because we said if a military base is the safest place for these children to be housed, then they should be housed there, better than leaving them on the street. I think that Mr. Crow has accounted for those concerns with his exceptions, and that's why I support the amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Conaway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm from Texas, as you know, and it would be our state courts and state laws that would be involved in this issue. Our state legislature just finished their every other year session, and one of the unresolved issues is the lack of foster care, the lack of care for children whose parental rights have been severed. And I can't imagine that Texas would want to step into those shoes, sever those parents' rights, and then take possession of those children, if that's what this is intending to have happen. It may be okay for somebody from Colorado to propose this, but somebody from Texas is not interested in these children being loaded onto the state. We already bear a disproportionate share of the wreck that is the lack of control at our borders. And to add this to that, I don't think our state folks would be really willing to step into this role to then assume custody of these children. And with that, I would reserve.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Escobar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crow, I want to thank you for your amendment. I want you to know that children are still being forcibly separated from their parents in my district. We have casework that identifies those families. We are raising the issue with the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security because it is happening, and so I see this as a very valuable, important amendment, and I want to thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar. I will, can I use the remaining amount of my time, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely, Mr. Crow.
Yeah, just to address some of the points on the opposite side of the aisle here. Yeah, this is a very narrowly tailored amendment with exceptions to account for some of the law enforcement activities you had discussed earlier, to account for the need in some circumstances to remove a child if that child's safety and well-being requires that. But overall, the thrust of this amendment remains the same, and that is to ensure that our men and women in uniform at our military installations are not being involved and put in the position of having to house forcibly separated accompanied minors who are forcibly separated from the folks who have brought them over, their parents or guardians. They are not to house those children and get involved in that policy.
Any further discussion? You guys want to move? Okay, we're good. All right. No further discussion. The question occurs on the amendment by Mr. Crow. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion share, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. It is now in order to consider en bloc package number 5. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 5, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority without objection, so ordered. I like the way I'm kind of talking to myself here, but will the clerk please distribute the en bloc amendment? Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. En bloc package number 5 is comprised of the following. All right. And these are the log numbers that I'm reading. 026R3 by Mr. Turner, 040 by Ms. Spear, 050 by Ms. Hill, 067R1 by Mr. Gates, 075R2 by Mr. Larson, 084R3 by Ms. Gabbard, 093R1 by Ms. Torres-Small, 02R4 by Mr. Brown, 113R1 by Mr. Brown, 114R3 by Mr. Brown. Turn the page. 117R1 also by Mr. Brown, 118R1 by Mr. Brown, 132R1 by Mr. Whitman, 135R2 by Mr. Cisneros, 139 by Ms. Slotkin, 144R1 by Ms. Hartzler, 148R1 by Ms. Horn, 163R1 by Mr. Kim, 179R1 by Ms. Spear. Is there discussion on the en bloc amendment? Hearing none, all those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. En bloc number 5 is adopted. It is now in order to consider en bloc package number 6. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 6, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will distribute the en bloc amendment. Without objection, it will be considered as read. En bloc number 6 consists of the following amendments. Amendment number 214 by Mr. Langevin. Amendment number 220R1 by Mr. Kelly. Amendment number 226 by Dr. Abraham. Number 256R1 by Mr. Byrne, number 286 by Mr. Graves, number 288R2 by Mr. Courtney, number 290 by Mr. Courtney, number 292R1 by Mr. Courtney, number 295 by Ms. Trahan, number 296 by Ms. Trahan, number 302R1 by Mr. Bolton, number 311 by Mr. Gallego, number 321R1 by Ms. Houlihan, number 327R1 by Ms. Holland, number 338R1 by Mr. Desjardins, number 339 by Mr. Carbajal, number 347R1 by Ms. Holland, number 354R1 by Dr. Abraham, Number 356 by Ms. Sherrill, number 3621R1 by Mr. Thornberry, number 365 by Mr. Thornberry, number 368 by Mr. Thornberry. Is there discussion on the en bloc package?
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, who speaks?
Right.
Oh, Mr. Kelly.
Knowing the time of day and how this is an issue, one of these en bloc amendments that I want to speak on is Space A. It's for families of fallen heroes, our Gold Star families who have sacrificed so much for this country, and many of them had dreams of using Space A after retiring for travel. The survivors' dreams shouldn't be upended because of the death of their loved one in service to this country. And this amendment creates a new Space A travel category for loved ones left behind, and it's just a small gesture of appreciation from a grateful nation and a grateful member of Congress to these Gold Star families. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of en bloc package number 6 will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. Ayes have it. En bloc package number 6 is adopted. It's now in order to consider en bloc package number 7. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 7, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved by the minority. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, it will be considered as read. En bloc package number 7 consists of the following. Amendment number 369 by Mr. Thornberry. Amendment number 382 by Mr. Norcrest. Amendment number 392R1 by Mr. Lamborn. Amendment number 437R3 by Mr. Gallagher. Amendment number 441R1 by Mr. Gallagher. Amendment number 448 by Ms. Escobar. Number 452R2 by Mr. Langevin. Number 468R2 by Mr. Scott. Number 469 by Mr. Smith. Number 479R1 by Mr. Norcrest. Number 488R1 by Ms. Gabbard. Number 494 by Mr. Thornberry. Number 502R1 by Mr. Norcrest. Number 48R1 by Mr. Crow. Number 189 by Mr. Banks. Number 371R1 by Mr. Thornberry. Number 284R1 by Mr. Walls. Oh, that was the last one. Is there any discussion of the en bloc package? Hearing none, all those in favor will say aye. Opposed will say no. Ayes have it. En bloc package number 7 is adopted. Which brings us to the last en bloc package. En bloc package number 8. I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 8, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority, sorry. Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will distribute the amendment. Without objection, it will be considered as read. And en bloc package number 8 is comprised of the following. Number 037R1 by Ms. Spear, number 445R1 by Mr. Banks, number 069 by Ms. Gabbard, number 051R1 by Ms. Hill, number 031R1 by Ms. Spear, number 508 by Mr. Bacon, number 459R1 by Ms. Carbajal, number 308R2 by Mr. Gallego, number 209 by Mr. Langevin. This is going to go on for a while, by the way. Number 322R1 by Ms. Houlihan, number 447R2 by Ms. Escobar, number 035R3 by Ms. Spear, number 185R1 by Mr. Cooper, number 350R2 by Mr. Garamendi, number 105 by Mr. Brown, number 380R2 by Mr. Kim, number 328R1 by Ms. Holland, number 086 by Ms. Gabbard, number 513 by Ms. Holland, number 253 by Mr. Rogers, number 005R1 by Mr. Turner, number 390R2 by Mr. Lamburn, number 006R1 by Mr. Turner. Is there discussion on the en bloc package? Mr. Bacon.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out how grateful I am to the committee here for having the emergency MILCON put in. We've been working this for weeks. We thought we had it yesterday, it came back out, but we've just been able to get that added. But you know, there was a $4.8 billion in damage was the estimate. And the emergency supplemental that we passed a few weeks back was $1.6 billion. That left a big delta. And the appropriators appropriated most of that contingent on this committee authorizing it. And this is what this does. And this will have a huge impact for Camp Lejeune, Cherry Point, Tyndall Air Force Base, and Offutt Air Force Base. My base, 30 buildings were destroyed. And so this is a great amendment, and I just want to thank the committee. I yield back.
If gentlemen yield, there are more amendments to en bloc package number 8. I did not read them all, and I'm pretty sure that the thing stapled it. We put this together at the last minute, so if you will indulge me for just a minute, I want to make sure that I read all the ones that were supposed to be read. Yeah, I did not. Okay, so we're going to think of, sorry about that, we're going to think of Mr. Bacon's comments there as an interlude. And we are back on en bloc package number 8, and we're going to have to agree to adopt it. I'm pretty sure this is where I left off. So we're going to continue with 037R2 by Ms. Spear, number 445R1 by Mr. Banks. Did we already cover these? 086 by Ms. Gabbard. So it's only the last page that we didn't get to. So, yeah. Okay, I did I did, okay. 2 handwritten ones which were added at the last minute. And man, am I having trouble reading this. There we go. Number 264R1 by Mr. Bacon and number 470R1 by Mr. Smith. All right, is there further discussion on the en bloc amendments? Ms. Torres-Small.
Thank you. I just rise to speak quickly about the importance of small business protege programs. It allows small businesses to enter into contracting opportunities with the military. It grows rural communities, and it helps support a pipeline.
Further discussion en bloc. And ironically, I have to discuss one of the en bloc amendments. This has to do with the launch language which we've negotiated, and we can all be thankful that we were spared a larger debate. But I want to make clear the intent of the language that we came up with was basically to make sure we had a maximum amount of competition, while at the same time, the intent of the language is to maintain the current request for proposal and acquisition schedule for what is referred to as Phase 2. We do not wish to slow down that schedule at all or alter the RFP involved in the process of going through with Phase 2. We were trying to do some different things that aren't worth getting into, but we have no intention of upsetting the current acquisition schedule for Phase 2 launch determinations. Is there further discussion in the en bloc amendments? Hearing none, all those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. En bloc number 8 is adopted. And that is log number 374 by Mr. Thornberry. For what purpose does Mr. Thornberry seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will distribute the amendment, and we will dispense with the reading of said amendment. Mr. Thornberry is recognized. Now, we're going to try to keep 5 minutes for him, 5 minutes for me. We'll distribute it out. That's what we're going to try to do. We have talked about this subject earlier in the mark, so we have had our chance. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will try to be concise. This amendment would raise the top line in the bill to the same amount that the administration requested and the same amount that the Senate has already marked to. It represents right at a 3% real growth, which testimony has consistently been in this committee from 2 Secretaries of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, endorsed by the National Strategy Commission with 6 Democratic appointees, 6 Republican appointees, that that's the right amount. But I don't really want to focus on the amount. I want to focus on the substance, because when we put this together, we identified the specific things that this money would go for. Nearly every bit of it was either in the original administration request or in the unfunded requirements from the services. There are no lightning rods in here. There's no wall funding or anything like that. Where we agreed in the underlying mark to reduce an administration request, I did not go back and put it back in. I stuck with our agreement. everything in here is core responsibility of this committee. For example, $400 million for next generation air dominance, $100 million for F-15C repairs and parts. And by the way, 28 of those aircraft are currently grounded awaiting repairs and parts. All of this, by the way, goes back up to what the administration requested. We're not going above. This is what they asked for, to fix the F-15s. We add money for 6 F-35s, 1 E-2D Hawkeye. We restore money for $18 million for the Super Hornets as part of a 3-year, multi-year deal. Going to ground, we restore $4.8 million for amphibious combat vehicles, $5 million for armored multipurpose vehicles. In the sea area, we restore $211 million for CVN refueling overhauls. We put back in the administration request of $390 million to prevent a 1-year slip on CVN 81. We put back in $49.5 million for JDAMs, $25 million for Army tactical missiles. We restore $103 million for ground-based strategic deterrent. I mentioned earlier we put back in money for hypersonic development, unmanned surface vehicles, depot maintenance support for Army, National Guard, and Force Reserve. All of those and more is specifically laid out in the amendment before you. So this vote is not on some hypothetical number. It is on those specific capabilities, and that's what matters most. It is also, I would suggest, on how this committee can be relevant when it comes to negotiations with the Senate, and whether we can engage at a level that the administration and the Senate Armed Services Committee have already agreed to. It is possible, let me say one more thing. It is possible that there could be a cap deal in the future that would be at some other number. It may be 733, it may be 740, I don't know what it'd be. And I absolutely acknowledge that if and when there's a cap deal, and I hope it's tomorrow, that we should adjust our authorization to fit it. But where we are today, for this committee to authorize, I understand where the appropriators are, for us to authorize an amount less than the administration requested, less than the consistent testimony we have received, less than the Senate Armed Services Committee puts us at a disadvantage. So this is a vote mainly on the substance of the things I listed and otherwise. It's also a vote for us to have the most influence possible in the debates to come. I yield back.
Thank you. Just to walk back through the history, first of all, it's worth noting that $733 billion by about $17 billion is the largest defense budget ever. It is a 2.4% increase over last year's budget, which was also the largest defense budget ever. We have increased the defense budget a significant amount in each of the last 2 years and in this year. $733 billion is not a small amount of money. And to walk through the history, when we got the CAPS deal for FY18 and FY19, it was agreed to, or it was projected in the FIDA from the DOD, that they would ask for $733 billion in FY20. And as Chairman Dunford testified, that was what they've done for the last year, is to build their budget around that $733 billion number. And as recently as March, you had administration officials parading up the CENTCOM commander testified that 733 was what they needed to meet their national security objectives. Then the president said that he felt that the defense budget should be $700 billion. That caused a fair amount of consternation amongst his Republican the Republicans on the Hill, which prompted a discussion. You can't go down to 700, which is why I referenced earlier that on March 26th, about 70 Republicans, I think it was all House members, sent an urgent letter to the president saying, you have to stick to 733. Our national security is dependent upon that. They went over and had a discussion about this, and somehow The president's not a particularly good negotiator in my mind. He started at 733, he asked for 700, and after he negotiated, he came out at 750. That's not normally the way you're supposed to go in a negotiation. So the 733 number was a very informed number over a long period of time to arrive at that number. And it is a number that the Republicans, as recently as 3 months ago, were insisting upon. And I will also submit very strongly, as we've seen with the battle over the wall, it didn't take the Pentagon more than the blink of an eye to find $7 billion for this wall. It wasn't hard at all to take $1 billion out of MilPERS, to take it from other places. The Pentagon has a history of asking for money, in many instances, for programs that are not ready to spend that money yet. And if we give it to them, it discourages them from being efficient. And I honestly believe this. Now, Mr. Thornberry, I think, made a very valid point. Back when we, without warning, because of the Budget Control Act, cut the Pentagon by 20%, yeah, that you're not going to get much efficient when you're cut overnight by 20%. But we're increasing you by 2.4%. And then after we've done that, we throw another $17 billion at you. There is no incentive whatsoever to develop efficiency because you know there's more money coming around the corner. The Pentagon still can't perform an audit. They can't tell you where they spent last year's money. Can't do it. They can't tell you what's in their inventory. They can't tell you the amount of buildings that they have. There is inefficiency built into the Pentagon. If you just give them more money without asking for some rigor, and we had rigor on that 733 number, that's what they did over the course of the last year. They didn't do that for this $17 billion. Now, the ranking member read off a very impressive list. And let me tell you something. If we funded at 750, it wouldn't take anyone in this room more than about a half a day to come up with another list for another 17 or another 20 or another 30. There is always more money than you can spend at the Pentagon. But I think part of this committee's responsibility is to exercise oversight to ensure that that money is efficiently spent. I've often joked that defense is the one area where Republicans and conservatives seem to think that throwing money at the problem is perfectly okay. It's not. We have to insist upon efficiencies. Going artificially up to 750, which is, by the way, what the appropriators marked to in the House, I think is irresponsible. I think it takes away from our oversight responsibilities and from our demanding that our tax dollars be spent wisely and well. I do appreciate the debate. I just want to close by thanking all members for the debates we had. We're going to have about 12 or 13 amendments coming up here. I do urge a no vote on this amendment to enforce efficiency and to let the taxpayers know we're going to make sure they're getting their money's worth out of every dollar that we spend at the Pentagon. We're going to try to rein in some of that waste that we heard discussed today and that we've all witnessed during our time on this committee. With that, I yield back, and the question occurs on Mr. Thornberry's amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed will say no. No. I'll skip the analysis, ask for a recorded vote. So, we now have how many lined up here? I'm sorry, why are we whispering?
It's 12 or 13. I think we're tracking 13, but the decision has to be made on Ms. Escobar's.
Oh, sorry, I made that decision a while ago, just didn't tell anyone. We're not going to revisit that.
Okay, so 12.
There are 13 votes, and if we could get them up in order there, give us a minute to see them, put them up on the board before we start calling them. We'll then try to go through and explain what they are, since it's been a while since we had the debates.
Is there regions of unblocking the Guantanamo ones or anything?
I don't think so. The suggestion was to unblock all the Guantanamo votes, but I'm thinking that's probably not going to happen. So the suggestion was to unblock all of the Guantanamo votes in one big Guantanamo vote. Yeah, I didn't think so. I was asked. Figured I'd throw it out there. They're not quite all the same. So we're getting these things organized here. It'll take just a moment. Yes. Oh, it is. Yeah. And we might not win that vote, but we're going to have it. That's why we were trying to second. Okay.
But just the title or what it's about,
Yeah.
please.
I don't know. As we go one by one here, if before we do the roll call vote, you could say, first one is Lamborn 500. Briefly, what is it?
So
Yeah.
Lamborn 500 requires report by SecDef on how implementing net zero emissions and
That's
implementing
it's the Green New Deal.
Green New Deal
And-
will
all
affect
right.
military readiness.
We know what it is. Roll call.
Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes aye. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Torres Small is recorded no.
I'd like to be recorded yes.
So done. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 31, the noes are 26.
I believe the Boise, I think
Do you want me
Los
to read it?
Angeles class submarine, and taking the money from the R&D program on low
Low enriched uranium.
enriched uranium. So the $20 million swap. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith.
No.
Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry. Aye. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes yes. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes yes. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Ms. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes aye. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes aye. On this vote, the ayes are 33 and the noes are 24.
Issue dealing with reporting of civilian casualties within DOD and DNI. I think we remember that. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith votes aye. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes no. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes aye. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes aye. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes no. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes no. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes no. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes no. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes no. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes no. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes aye. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes no. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes aye. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes aye. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded? Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Who's asking the question?
How am I recorded?
I think so.
If you would like me to.
Thank you.
Which member was that? Mr. Whitman.
Mr. Whitman is registered aye.
If you would record me as a no. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cisneros. Mrs. Cisneros votes aye. On this vote, the ayes are 29 and the noes are 28.
Now we are moving on to Guantanamo Palooza. And the first one is Mr. Walls, which would, the underlying bill prohibits any further transfer to Guantanamo. This would strip that to allow further transfer or further, not transfers, but put more people in Guantanamo. So clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith.
No.
Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis.
No.
Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson.
Aye.
Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin.
No.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper.
No.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Can the member repeat the vote?
Say it again.
Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torrey Small. Ms. Torrey Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Ms. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 26, and the noes are 31.
No.
Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lambourne. Mr. Lambourne votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torrey Small. Ms. Torrey Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Mrs. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no.
If there are members who want to change their vote or whatever, feel free to speak up and we'll take you. I won't ask you every time.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 26, the noes are 31.
The amendment is defeated. And next up is Mr. Banks. This is the one that prohibits construction of anything in the U.S. to house Guantanamo inmates, I believe. Yes. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith, no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no. On this vote, the ayes are 26, the noes are 31. On this vote, the ayes are 26, the noes are 31. Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. On this vote, the ayes are 26 and the noes are 31.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman votes no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mrs. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torrey Small. Ms. Torrey Small votes aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 29, the noes are 28.
We now move on to Amendment 245, which begins getting us into the border issues. And this is to strike Section 1046. And 1046 is the limit on presidential and departmental efforts to build emergency assistance walls along the southwest border. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith.
No.
Chairman Smith, no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry, aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Sorry. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Sorry, Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lambourne. Mr. Lambourne votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher? Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros? Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon? Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow? Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torrey Small? Ms. Torrey Small votes no. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin? Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria? Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 26, the noes are 31.
Now we are moving on to Mr. Rogers' Amendment 247, which also goes after some of the provisions that restrict the president's ability to do emergency powers to redirect money for wall construction, roughly speaking. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith?
No.
Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry? Aye. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway? Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard? Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal? Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins? Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella? Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham? Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim? Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher? Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros? Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon? Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow? Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torres Small? Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin? Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no. On this vote, the ayes are 26 and the noes are 31.
Is defeated, and it's now in order to consider Mr. Rogers' amendment number 244, which again changes some of the emergency, changes provisions in the bill that, or strikes provisions in the bill that were changing the president's emergency powers to provide assistance on the southwest border. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Avella. Mr. Avella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Ms. Trahan. Ms. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no. On this vote, the ayes are 26 and the noes are 31.
Is defeated. It's now in order to consider 229R1 by Ms. Hartzler, which again had to do with border issues, roughly speaking. We'll leave it at that. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Sorry, can the member repeat that? Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torrey Small. Ms. Torrey Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Holland. Sorry, Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 26, the noes are 31.
The amendment is defeated. We now have Mr. Thornberry's amendment on adding $17 billion to the mark. I will point out to members, after this amendment, we will also have a vote on adoption of the full committee mark. So that'll be a recorded vote as well. Clerk will call the roll on Mr. Thornberry, 374.
Chairman Smith.
No.
Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis.
No.
Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin.
No.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. No. Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torrey Small. Ms. Torrey Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes yes. Okay. Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 27, the noes are 30.
For the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the chairman's mark as amended.
I know this is going to roll call, so why don't we just go ahead and, well, I ask for a roll call vote.
Chairman Smith.
Clerk, aye.
Chairman Smith votes aye. Mr. Thornberry. No. Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Larson. Aye. Mr. Larson votes aye.
Can I
Mr.
interrupt the roll call
Turner.
for just one quick second? I apologize. I want to make 100% clear this is not final passage. You are not permitted to leave. We have to vote on final passage, which will come up in a minute.
Mr. Chairman, if while we're interrupted, if I could ask, once you voted on this, Republican members of the committee to just step in this room for a very brief discussion, and then we'll come back out to have the final passage vote.
We are voting on the full committee mark. So
Adoption of the full committee provisions that we just have been getting through.
Right. Sorry, yeah, I should have explained that. The clerk will resume the roll call.
Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes no. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes no. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Carbajal? Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes aye. Dr. Desjardins? Dr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Vella? Mr. Vella votes aye. Dr. Abraham? Dr. Abraham votes no. Mr. Kim? Mr. Kim votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes no. Ms. Horn? Ms. Horn votes aye. Mr. Gallagher? Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Cisneros? Mr. Cisneros votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Bacon? Mr. Bacon votes no. Mr. Crow? Mr. Crow votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Ms. Torres Small? Ms. Torres Small votes aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney votes no. Ms. Slotkin? Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes no. Ms. Sherrill? Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman votes no. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill votes aye. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz votes no. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes aye. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden votes aye. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mrs. Luria? Mrs. Luria votes aye.
So while we're waiting for the tally, I'll just point out that now that all the Republicans have left the room, we have a quorum. We can do whatever we wanted. So talk amongst yourself. Let us know what you're... Yeah, I see the reason for bipartisanship now.
On this vote, the ayes are 31 and the noes are 26.
The motion is adopted. The full committee report is adopted. We're going to move on to final passage in just a couple of minutes. So talk amongst yourselves. It'll only be another couple of minutes here.
How do you feel? Like relieved?
Not bad. Well, I'm not relieved until we actually get the thing out.
Right.
No. Well, I'm gonna. Yeah, not. I'm not gonna argue. I am gonna thank a couple of clerk. Yeah. Okay. All right. We will reconvene. Before we go to the motion for final passage, I just want to thank all the members of the committee. Certainly, I think we had very good debates, and I think upheld the tradition of the committee quite well. And I appreciate all of your fine work. And more than anything, I want to thank the staff. Yes, that is appropriate. And just say, we've been up all night today. They've been up all night for at least a week. So very much appreciate their work. And I think the kindest thing we can do for them is get down and get them home. So I will be brief, and I will yield to Mr. Thornberry for any comments he has.
Mr. Chairman, I share your appreciation for the staff. It is literally true that some of our committee staff have spent the last 2 nights in the office here before tonight. I also want to thank all the personal staff. And I want to thank my 3 interns, Jack, Carter, and Cole, who have been manning the wall and the door all day and night with us. And finally, I want to thank the intrepid press who has been able to stay up all night with us. I didn't think y'all could do it.
We were trying to wear them down.
I know. Mr. Chairman, if I could make one more comment. Sure. All of us have invested a lot in this committee and feel very strongly about it. I hope that this bill improves from everybody's standpoint as it moves through the process. And I'll leave it there.
Yes. In my experience, it usually does. So we'll keep working on it. And with that, I will recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown, for the purpose of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report the bill, H.R.2500, as amended, favorably to the House with a recommendation that it do pass.
Question on the motion from the gentleman from Maryland. I'm pretty sure this requires a recorded vote, so the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith.
Aye.
Chairman Smith votes aye. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes no. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes no. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna votes aye. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes aye. Dr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes aye. Dr. Abraham. Dr. Abraham votes no. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly votes no. Ms. Horn. Ms. Horn votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes aye. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes no. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney votes no. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman votes no. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes aye. Mr. Waltz. Mr. Waltz votes no. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland votes aye. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden votes aye. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan votes aye. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria votes aye.
Did you guys reach agreement on that? Yeah. Okay. Clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, Chairman, the ayes are 33 and the noes are 24.
The bill is passed and out of committee, and we are adjourned. Thank you. I'm sorry. Hey, sorry, we're not a... You guys can go. I've got some procedural stuff I've got to read, so...
Thanks.
Quorum being present, the motion is adopted without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, consistent with House rules, I'd like to assert the right of any member to file supplemental minority, additional, and dissenting views for inclusion in the committee report to the House on the bill just ordered reported.
Pursuant to Clause 2L of House Rule 11, all members are entitled to not less than 2 calendar days to file such views in writing. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary conforming technical and clerical changes and to remove from the bill as amended provisions that would cause the bill to be referred to other committees or would result in additional direct spending or that would result in an earmark. Without objection, so ordered. Finally, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to make such motions on the floor as necessary to go to the conference with the Senate on the bill H.R.2500 or a similar Senate measure. Without objection, so ordered. If there is no further business, the committee stands adjourned, subject to the call of the chair.